So it is my pleasure today to introduce Carol Azzam Mackay, and she is the Design Innovation Associate at Nandin ANSTO's Innovation Centre. Carol is an expert in the intersection of design and science and approaches to catalyse innovation, with a broad experience across industry and research. She facilitates the challenge-based innovation and design programs at Nandin, supporting Nandin members, ANSTO staff, and the broader community with learning of innovation practice. During her PhD, Carol facilitated design practice at Sydney Nano to help deliver cutting-edge smart sensing technologies for the Royal Australian Air Force. Through this, Carol challenged barriers to multidisciplinary and encouraged shifting towards collaborative and creative future of science. Her career journey spans many other scientific fields, including forensic analysis, inorganic chemistry, research, science communication, and design theory. Carol draws on this experience as a strong foundation for her multidisciplinary role. So Carol, I welcome you to the WiN Australia Annual General Meeting and allow you to present to us.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. If I might share, is it okay if I can share my screen? Now, just give me 1 second. Just want to double check that everyone can see my slides clearly.
Yes.
Full screen, okay. Great. Okay, so once again, hello everyone. My name is Carol Azzam Mackay. Thank you so much for inviting me to your AGM. It's my pleasure to be here and chat with you a little bit about my journey and this topic I'm really passionate about, which is design as a catalyst for innovation in science. Just to introduce myself, I'm the Design Innovation Associate at Nandin, ANSTO's Innovation Centre. That's my photo right there, surrounded by some, not all, I didn't get a chance to get everyone's photos before lockdown, but some of this amazing Nandin community. This includes ANSTO staff, as well as graduate students, industry partners, mentors, and members from over 30 startups and counting. I started my role in late April of this year, and it's been an action-packed, hands-on journey so far. But I didn't start my career journey even considering design. Back in school, I thought that design was only about making products or apps or beautiful spaces. I later realized that those types of design had their own terms like industrial or interior or UX design. But design innovation was a totally different world. But I wouldn't be exposed to that world for many more years. I start my journey in late high school. I found myself drawn to chemistry, physics, and maths. I had really supportive family and teachers that noticed I was a total science nerd, so they encouraged me to apply for the National Youth Science Forum in 2013. This was an incredible opportunity to experience a STEM career hands-on and meet like-minded students across the country. Just as an aside, if you have any children or know any students who are interested in STEM, let me seriously encourage you to suggest they attend NYSF, because it was a truly remarkable experience that shaped so much of my love for science and my career trajectory. Coming out of that program, I started a science degree at Sydney Uni. It was here where I found myself really drawn to chemistry. That's what I majored in, and I loved especially the hands-on side. I loved experiments, I loved lab work, summer projects, all a definite highlight. Organic chemistry, not so much, it's not for me. But anyway, partway through my degree in 2016, I spent a year in industry at the National Measurement Institute in their Australian Forensic Drug Lab. Again, a huge learning curve. I learned so much about forensic science, and it was a really great first-hand experience of a career as a chemist. But it also got me thinking more about the way we do science in industry, because it was really quite different to what I'd seen in the more academic context at uni. I came back after that year to my third year of uni, and when it came to choosing my subjects, I still had that curiosity around this topic of science in the real world. I spent hours rifling through different units of study until I found this random elective that popped up. It was the first year they were running Innovation Design Studio. The subject description talked about problem solving, creativity, real world issues. But if I'm perfectly transparent with you, while that was very appealing, what drove it home for me was a lack of prerequisites and no final exam, which was a huge sigh of relief for a science student. It's like, sign me up. I was the only science student in the whole class, which was intimidating to say the least. But what I thought would be just a random elective turned out to be my favorite class. I fell in love and there was no going back. 6 months later, I signed up for a PhD in a totally different faculty to my undergrad, exploring this topic of design as a catalyst for innovation in science. In my PhD, I was working as a design ambassador, I guess, in the Jericho Smart Sensing Lab, which was a research team at Sydney Nano who were developing smart sensing solutions for the Royal Australian Air Force. That same year, I also started working part-time as an education officer at ANSTO. And that's where I was first introduced to Nandin and all the fantastic work ANSTO is doing in innovation and science. A whirlwind 3 or so years later, I find myself working in that very space. Really thankful for a career and a journey at this messy, fantastic intersection of design, science, and innovation. But what does it actually mean to be innovative in science? It's quite a vague and nebulous concept, just saying it like that. And how might we begin to have a conversation about this, let alone establish procedures and processes? A place I like to start is with this quote from Raymond Willem in his very aptly named work, Design and Science. And he says that through design, science is made visible. Design is a process in which creativity and science interact to produce novelty. Design innovation is commonly defined as the intersection between desirability, viability, and feasibility. Now, within the context of science, we're very familiar with the feasibility part. That refers to the technology or area of research in question. So we ask what works, what doesn't work, what's been discovered or invented, what knowledge is out there. This is the part that the scientific method has got covered down pat. Then we take another step further. When we take science into industry, we also see a really decent consideration of the viability. That's the business side. So not only do we ask what works, but we ask what works well. How is it different from competitors? How do we commercialize our technology? What's the business model and the IP? How do we make a technology into a product? But the also common problem is that we stop there. We have a fantastic piece of research, a great idea for a business model, complete with logo and all the bells and whistles, and then we encounter this. This is the dreaded Valley of Death, an appropriately dismal name for the place where supposedly great ideas go to die. The Valley of Death refers to the gap between the discovery of a promising opportunity and the delivery of a valuable solution. Now, there is a very large body of work out there attempting to traverse the Valley of Death to make resources more accessible or commercialization more attainable. But the design innovation approach questions whether we need to find ourselves in this position at all. We try to challenge our assumptions and avoid an attack, before we get to this point. We challenge our assumptions early and often. You'll recall that I said that supposedly great ideas die here, and the wording is intentional because design innovation argues that without the third circle in the Venn diagram, without desirability, sometimes all we are working with is exactly that, a supposition. Desirability, the human element, people are at the heart of design. You can have a fantastic piece of knowledge. You can put a business case to turn that knowledge into a product. But at the end of the day, the product will be placed in someone's hands. There is always a user at the end of the journey. Now, balancing these three concepts is a lot easier said than done. And it's especially challenging in science when we're often working within really strict technical constraints or the user group is extremely niche. That intersection point can feel like it's getting smaller and smaller. But it's not impossible. There's actually a whole pedagogy behind the practice of design, and my experience specifically is in how we best apply that body of work to the field of science. One of the simplest and most tangible approaches is called design thinking. The thing to remember is that design thinking is both a mindset and a methodology. It involves understanding the end user, uncovering the root problem, challenging assumptions and brainstorming creative ideas, building and testing those ideas, and then ultimately delivering a solution that meets a real user need. Now, when I put it like that, it sounds pretty straightforward, like a nice little formula to hack your way to a great idea. But in reality, design is anything but straightforward. The concepts might be pretty intuitive. You'll be hard pressed to find someone who will disagree with the theory of being creative or solving problems. But to put it into practice is a totally different ballgame. This diagram, I love the name. It's called the design squiggle. Although I've got some colleagues at Sydney Nano who prefer design spaghetti, I'll let you choose which one you like. But basically this was developed by Damien Newman to describe the journey from uncertainty, vague patterns, random problem insights, through to the clarity and focus of a solution. It's also just a really good visualization of how it feels to go through a design process. Basically what we're describing is one of the fundamental concepts in design, and that is problem centricity. But you'll see that even after we work our way around the problem, it's still not straightforward. The journey has ups and downs and loops. And that's because, pardon the pun, it's designed that way. Looking at these 5 phases, it might sound like they're in some sort of order, but a more realistic diagram would be this one. To truly design effectively, you need to iterate, challenge your assumptions, rinse and repeat, and start all over again. So a more realistic design journey might say, start with understanding the end user, define a problem, start to brainstorm some solutions, and then realize maybe it's more important to do some more user research. You might do some iterative ideation and prototyping sessions, which leads you to redefine your problem statement. Then you might bring in your users again for some feedback, all of this happening multiple times before you deploy your solution. You have to be comfortable with the unknown, with scrapping everything, even comfortable with failure. Now, when I first heard this in that Design 101 class as a third-year science student, I was like, this sounds terrifying, to be perfectly honest. I questioned, okay, well, if it's so uncomfortable, if they keep drilling it home that it's this messy, crazy process, unpredictable, why design at all? And as a chemistry student, I said, well, we've got the scientific method. That looks much prettier than this. And hasn't that been enough so far? So this process, something I was much more familiar with, just like the design process, the scientific method has different stages, each with unique principles, methods, and approaches. We start with an observation, which usually comes from the immense suite of existing knowledge. We pose questions about our observations. We hypothesize potential answers. We test our hypothesis through experiments and research. We analyze the outcomes to see if our hypothesis was correct or what further investigation is necessary. And then eventually we come to a conclusion, which almost indefinitely leads to more observations and questions. So I'll ask again, when this process has demonstrated so much rigor and stood the test of time, why would we even bother with this conversation? I learned that we design because it's how we get to solutions that make a difference. This is a quote from Henry Ford reflecting on the invention of the car, where he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. This is a really great example of why we cannot work from our own assumptions. The same rigor that we as scientists apply to the scientific method needs to be applied to the way we explore the problems we are trying to solve before we set foot in the lab or the research space, to make sure they are problems in the first place and not a retrofit solution in search of a problem to create. The principles of design thinking invite us to dive headfirst into this really challenging part of scientific innovation, and that is the balance between user centricity and tech-driven product development. As I mentioned before, understanding the end user is critical in traversing this valley of death, which is why design thinking places empathy at the heart of the process. Design takes us from merely solving problems to solving problems that matter. So in response to that, in the face of all this discomfort, we lean into it. A common saying in design is fail fast, fail often, succeed sooner. The more iterative and flexible we are in our approach, the faster we learn from mistakes and the sooner we deliver something that's actually valuable. In the research space, where time is money, and let's be honest, money is money, adopting a design process reduces risk, wasted time, sunken cost, even heartache by not shying away from the difficult questions. Once we learn how to embrace this principle, then design can truly start to catalyze innovation. Now, we've talked a lot about design, but I personally prefer to see it put into practice. So I've got this case study. I would have loved to present a case study from Nandin that I've run, but as I mentioned, I've only been here since April, and lockdown put a bit of a break on some of my plans. But I've got this fantastic case study instead from the international design community. This is where the Stanford D School design team invented something called the Embrace Baby Carrier, which is a life-changing and ultimately life-saving solution for premature infant mortality in the developing world. The foundation of this whole project was empathy. The Stanford design team put themselves in the shoes of a brand new parent in a remote and isolated community, desperate to find help for their struggling premature baby. Access to suitable healthcare and finances was often a challenge, and there were times when if the baby was really premature, their life could have been at risk. However, the research team did not just rely on their own interpretation and assumptions around the problem from the bubble of their university campus offices. They went to hospitals in Nepal. They interviewed real doctors and nurses and parents, and they totally challenged their problem statement. You see, their first idea was to build a cheaper incubator, until the doctors revealed the hospital incubators were empty. They learned that, in fact, the real issue lied in remote communities where babies were born at home with very little hope of making it to the hospital for treatment. This meant that parents were resorting to makeshift incubators like the ones pictured here, or desperately trying to use non-medical lamps to warm the babies, which were unable to be regulated effectively. This completely reframed the problem definition. It became a question of how might we equip remote communities with a cheap, easy to use and safe solution to infant hypothermia. Equipped with a new problem statement, the researchers returned to the empathize phase. So they conducted interviews with mothers, healthcare workers, even local shopkeepers. They did extensive research about infant mortality and hypothermia, And they use storytelling to combine all of these insights to allow for true empathy with the situation. All of the design team's findings led them to ideate the concept of the Embrace infant warmer. Now, this looks nothing like an incubator, and that's often what happens with a design solution. It's really not like what you expected at first. The Embrace infant warmer is similar to a sleeping bag. It's a covering that wraps around the infant with a seamless material for comfort and also, more importantly, to allow it to be sanitized between uses. The bag has a pouch where a wax-like phase-changing material can be inserted, which keeps the baby warm for up to 7 hours, after which it can simply be reheated again. But as I keep mentioning, design is iterative. The team didn't just develop this prototype, make thousands of it, deploy it, and then fly back home. They actually issued just a few prototypes to observe how real parents and healthcare professionals, how real end users were interacting with the carrier. And this revealed some really critical insights. For example, they uncovered a cultural barrier where in previous experiences in these communities, when they had imported Western medicines, they tended to use half doses. They considered that it would be too strong, and they were concerned about it being too strong. And so that approach actually translated to the way parents were using the baby carrier. They were worried it would get too hot, so they only heated it halfway. Of course, this wasn't reaching the optimal temperature and wasn't effective for incubating the baby. And so the designers replaced the temperature strip with a really clear OK indicator. So it was just, is it ready or is it not ready? And that allowed them to make sure that parents were using it optimally. Similarly, they also learned that in many communities, electricity was unreliable or unavailable at all. So they developed a new prototype that didn't need electricity. It could be heated using hot water. Now equipped with these insights, the final product was launched. And thanks to design, it could actually be implemented effectively to help communities most in need and ultimately save lives. To summarize, Herbert Simon, in his 1968 work, The Sciences of the Artificial, puts it really nicely. He says that the natural sciences are concerned with how things are. Design, on the other hand, is concerned with how things ought to be. Now, this quote is from 1968. That's over 50 years ago. I would argue that you'd be hard-pressed to find a STEM professional today who is not interested in how things ought to be. And yet, multidisciplinarity still remains such a huge challenge, and disciplinary silos still turn into roadblocks. This is a challenge we need to tackle, and with increasing urgency. There is the imperative to innovate, not just invent. And it is this imperative upon which design can bring real value to scientific research. Yes, design and science are two unique approaches, but they share the same common goal: innovative solutions to problems that matter, turning how things are into how things ought to be. I hope this talk has piqued your interest, and if it has, we would love to see you at Nandin. If you're keen to learn more, maybe you'd like to experience a hands-on design sprint, or maybe your team has a problem you'd like to workshop through a creative design process, please do reach out. Our vision at Nandin is to foster a collaborative and creative environment for knowledge exchange. Nandin is also a member of the Design Factory Global Network, which is an international community of unis, design practitioners, and innovation centers of excellence. And so we draw on this global community of best practice to really build innovative solutions to overcome unmet challenges. That's where I come in. I'm currently developing our new Design Factory capability and innovation programs. With our new building and soon coming back onto site, we are really getting ready to ramp up. So it's the perfect time to jump in. The new building is a purpose-built innovation space with our Proto Lab for prototyping and our Create Lab media facility, as well as a whole bunch of collaborative areas, all designed to facilitate experiential learning or hands-on learning by doing. Some of our capabilities include team building, especially fostering cohesion and best practice in multidisciplinary teams or working with unified vision in diverse teams, effective end user engagement and empathy, problem exploration, creative brainstorming and ideation, product development through lo-fi prototyping, and user testing and feedback, including preparing pitches and processing user insights. So if any of this has caught your eye, please come along for a visit or reach out to me. I would love to chat some more. I'd just like to say thank you again to the Women in Nuclear team for the very kind invitation to speak with you all. I'm very honoured to have been here. I'd love to open the floor for questions, and of